Be ready. Start. The juristic theory regarding acceptability of a dying declaration is that such declaration is made in extremity when the party is at the point of death and when every hope of this world is gone, when every motive to falsehood is silenced and the man is induced by the most powerful consideration to speak only the truth. Notwithstanding the same, great caution must be exercised in considering the weight to be given to this species of evidence on account of the existence of many circumstances which may affect their truth. The situation in which a man is on the deathbed is so solemn and serene is the reason in law to accept the veracity of his statement. It is for this reason the requirements of oath and cross examination are dispensed with. Since the accused has no power of cross examination, the courts insist that the dying declaration should be of such a nature as to inspire full confidence of the court in its truthfulness and correctness. The court, however, has always to be on guard to see that the statement of the deceased was not as a result of either tutoring or prompting or a product of imagination. The court also must further decide that the deceased was in a fit state of mind and had the opportunity to observe and identify the assailant. Normally, therefore, the court, in order to satisfy whether the deceased was in a fit mental condition to make the dying declaration, looks up to the medical opinion. But where the eyewitnesses state that the deceased was in a fit and conscious state to make the declaration, the medical opinion will not prevail, nor can it be said that since there is no certification of the doctor as to the fitness of the mind of the declarant, the dying declaration is not acceptable. A dying declaration can be oral or in writing, and any adequate method of communication, whether by words or by signs or otherwise, will suffice provided the indication is positive and definite. In most cases, however, such statements are made orally before death ensues and is reduced to writing by someone like a magistrate or a doctor or a police officer. When it is recorded, no oath is necessary, nor is the presence of a magistrate absolutely necessary, although to assure authenticity, it is usual to call a magistrate, if available, for recording the statement of a man about to die. There is no requirement of law that a dying declaration must necessarily be made to a magistrate, and when such statement is recorded by a magistrate, there is no specified statutory form for such recording. Consequently, what evidential value or weight has to be attached to such statement necessarily depends on the facts and circumstances of each particular case. What is essentially required is that the person who records a dying declaration must be satisfied that the deceased was in a fit state of mind, where it is proved by the testimony of the magistrate that the declarant was fit to make the statement even without examination by the doctor. The declaration can be acted upon provided the court ultimately holds the same to be voluntary and truthful. A certification by the doctor is essentially a rule of caution, and therefore the voluntary and truthful nature of the declaration can be established otherwise. Now we come to the second submission raised on behalf of the appellant, that the material witness has not been examined and the reliance cannot be placed upon the sole testimony of the police witness eyewitnesses. It is a settled proposition of law of evidence that it is not the number of witnesses that matters, but it is the substance. It is also not necessary to examine a large number of witnesses if the prosecution can bring home the guilt of the accused even with a limited number of witnesses. In the third category of witnesses, the court has to be cautious and see if the statement of such witness is corroborated either by the other witnesses or by other documentary or expert evidence. Equally, well settled is the proposition of law that where there is a sole witness to the incident, his evidence has to be accepted with caution and after testing it on the touchstone of evidence tendered by other witnesses or evidence otherwise recorded. The evidence of a sole witness should be cogent, reliable, and must essentially fit into the chain of events that have been stated by the prosecution. When the prosecution relies upon the testimony of a sole eyewitness, then such evidence has to be wholly reliable and trustworthy. Presence of such witness at the occurrence should not be doubtful. If the evidence of the sole witness is in conflict with the other witnesses, it may not be safe to make such a statement as a foundation of the conviction of the accused. These are the few principles which the court has stated consistently and with certainty. This court took the view that if the presence of a witness is doubtful, it becomes a case of conviction based on the testimony of a solitary witness. There is, however, no bar in basing the conviction on the testimony of a solitary witness so long as the said witness is reliable and trustworthy. Thank you.